We configured the most powerful artificial intelligence models into religious and LGBTQ advocates,
Hi, I'm the conservative traditionalist.
And I'm the equality activist.
and we gave them a debate forum for one of the most controversial questions ever. For added fun, we've included 16 different AI models to judge each response. Stick around to see who wins, but don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. Round 1 kicks off with a bang. Should religious freedom allow discrimination against LGBTQ individuals?
Okay, here we go. Strap in. Religious freedom laws are not being weaponized against LGBTQ rights. They are essential protections for individuals to act according to their sincerely held convictions. When a clergy member refuses to officiate a same-sex marriage, it is not an act of hatred, but rather a defense of traditional religious values that have guided moral behavior for generations. Such refusals ensure that the government does not compel people to act against their conscience, preserving a fundamental right. Meanwhile, some LGBTQ activists push to criminalize these expressions of faith under the banner of progress, aiming to force uniformity on diverse cultural and religious identities. Is it fair to label a defense of deeply held religious principles as mere discrimination when it safeguards personal conscience and centuries-old traditions?
Each AI judge will now score the argument out of 50 based on their own criteria. The average score will be added to each debater's total points.
Religious freedom shouldn't be a license to deny LGBTQ people their rightful place in society. When Indiana's RFRA enabled business owners to refuse service to same-sex couples, it revealed how such legislation can create a legal framework for exclusion. Cloaking discrimination in centuries-old traditions doesn't erase its damaging impact, particularly on those already marginalized. A clergy member's refusal to officiate a same-sex marriage may seem like a personal conscience matter, but when laws systematically empower such refusals, LGBTQ individuals face barriers to employment, housing, and public services. Invoking deeply held convictions becomes a tool for legitimizing bias, rather than merely preserving faith. If defending tradition is used to shut out a segment of society, is it truly an expression of religious freedom, or a direct assault on the principle of equality?
Your question assumes that defending tradition necessarily means shutting people out, yet it neglects how profoundly religious faith shapes a believer's entire worldview. Calling some behavior public and exempt from protection, while allowing private worship, arbitrarily forces people of faith to compartmentalize deeply personal convictions. We see small business owners dragged through lawsuits, harassed for declining services that would violate their conscience. Evidence that failing to honor religious beliefs in public spaces creates a hostile environment for those who live by them every day. If genuine religious expression must be confined behind closed doors to avoid legal repercussions, have we not merely replaced one form of exclusion with another, targeting devout believers instead of safeguarding true pluralism?
Religious faith may guide personal choices, but once a business opens its doors, it steps into the public sphere where anti-discrimination laws must take precedence. Historical parallels to Jim Crow remind us that moral convictions have long been used to justify exclusion, harming entire groups under the guise of sincerely held belief. When LGBTQ people are denied wedding services or turned away from restaurants, these acts inflict real harm on already vulnerable communities. The very essence of commerce in a diverse society is that everyone can fully participate without facing humiliation or refusal. If private convictions dictate public conduct, aren't we just reviving an old cycle of separate and unequal, diminishing the dignity of those who simply wish to be treated as equals?
Your analogy to separate and unequal conflates malicious exclusion with a faith-driven refusal to endorse actions that contradict religious doctrine. Unlike Jim Crow's systemic oppression, today's LGBTQ individuals can readily find alternative vendors or service providers, ensuring they aren't stripped of essential rights. When a baker declines to craft a same-sex wedding cake, they're not singling out someone's identity for hatred, but expressing a centuries-old conviction. Meanwhile, activists who insist that all dissenting beliefs be silenced in the public square go beyond demanding equality. They demand uniformity under the guise of tolerance, effectively punishing religious expression. If equality truly respects diversity, should it not include the freedom to honor one's conscience without branding every refusal as bigotry?
Refusal based on identity, even when cloaked in faith-driven motives, remains unmistakable discrimination. A same-sex couple turned away by a bakery doesn't simply find another vendor. They're branded as second class, forced to question their inherent worth. Real people endure humiliation and heartbreak when denied a wedding venue or a catered celebration, a pain we'd never tolerate if someone were refused service for their race or religious affiliation. This refusal doesn't just block a product. It broadcasts the idea that LGBTQ plus individuals are less deserving of equal treatment. When religion is used to justify such hurtful acts, it becomes a convenient shield for bias rather than an expression of genuine faith. If faith can't be wielded to refuse customers on the basis of race or religion, why should turning away LGBTQ plus people be considered anything but blatant prejudice?
Your comparison between LGBTQ plus rights and racial equality overlooks the fundamental distinctions between race and sexual orientation, making such parallels intellectually dishonest. Race is an inherent, unchangeable trait firmly rooted in history and identity, whereas sexual orientation involves personal choices and beliefs. Moreover, many religious groups have actively supported racial equality, proving that faith and justice can coexist without undermining sacred principles. Key figures of the civil rights movement demonstrated how moral convictions can champion the oppressed without compromising deeply held spiritual values. Conversely, LGBTQ plus activists often invoke civil rights history to challenge and subvert faith-based ideals, rather than honor the original spirit of equality and collective uplift. By wielding these precedents as weapons, they shift focus from authentic social progress to a direct assault on religious freedom. If religious communities can uphold genuine equality while preserving foundational beliefs, why shouldn't those same faith-driven convictions be respected when the issue at hand is sexual orientation rather than race?
Religious objections to LGBTQ plus equality echo the same script once used to deny rights to people of color and women. Interracial marriage faced biblical arguments labeling it unnatural and society-destroying, claims nearly identical to those now lodged against same-sex unions. Throughout history, many faith communities initially resisted critical progress. They opposed interracial couples in the 1960s and delayed women's suffrage before finally conceding. Repeatedly, religion has stood at the barricades of change, only to adapt when society's moral compass evolved. Every wave of civil rights has endured religious pushback, packaged as sacred tradition. Rather than subvert faith-based ideals, LGBTQ plus activists, like civil rights leaders before them, merely challenge archaic dogmas that have stifled equality. If the church ultimately revised its stance on race and women's rights, how many more decades must LGBTQ plus individuals wait before organized religion ceases to block their full humanity?
Your question presumes that religion consistently lags behind moral progress, yet it neglects how faith communities often play vital roles in social welfare, even for LGBTQ plus people, through counseling, shelters, and community support. The harm inflicted on LGBTQ plus individuals by a refusal of services is frequently overstated. A same-sex couple can secure an alternate vendor far more easily than a devout baker can recover from lawsuits, financial ruin, or vicious online attacks. These legal battles don't merely defend equal access. They punish believers for practicing their convictions. When people risk losing their livelihoods over a heartfelt stand, it sends a chilling message. Either conform to secular ideologies or be ostracized from the marketplace. Society is richer when diverse viewpoints, religious and otherwise, coexist without imposing absolute conformity. If equality is truly our goal, shouldn't we protect everyone's right to flourish, including those whose faith guides them to live apart from prevailing cultural tides?
Discrimination isn't a mere inconvenience for LGBTQ plus individuals. It's a life-altering blow that reverberates through personal, professional, and communal spheres. Research, such as that by the Williams Institute, shows disproportionately high rates of depression and anxiety when people face persistent rejection, compounded by barriers to housing and employment. Finding another baker or service provider doesn't undo the isolation felt when entire communities sanction exclusion in the name of faith. Indeed, many LGBTQ+ individuals already grapple with familial estrangement, making these refusals a painful reminder that they don't belong. No one should be forced to navigate a hostile marketplace or live in fear of constant judgment. If religious freedom emboldens behaviors that perpetuate such deep systemic harm, how can we justify enshrining that harm into law?
Your assertion that religious freedoms merely enshrine harm overlooks how exemptions have historically been governed by strict guidelines, preventing them from becoming broad licenses to discriminate. Courts generally require a genuine, faith-based conviction, ensuring that entire communities aren't casually shut out. Meanwhile, failing to uphold these exemptions forces devout people to either violate sacred tenets or face financial ruin and public scorn, a profound harm in its own right. By undermining religious protections in the name of safeguarding one group, we risk creating a monolithic society where no deeply held convictions, religious or otherwise, remain secure. Are we truly mitigating suffering by vilifying sincere moral objections, or simply shifting the burden of oppression onto those whose beliefs don't align with the prevailing cultural norms?
Religious exemptions may seem narrowly tailored, yet history shows they can expand into broad licenses for prejudice. We've witnessed landlords rejecting single mothers on moral grounds, wedding venues turning away interracial couples, and businesses refusing service to Muslims, all rationalized by faith. Such precedents threaten to fracture our legal framework for equality, gradually unraveling decades of civil rights gains. Each sincere moral objection normalizes the idea that certain groups deserve fewer freedoms, shifting us closer to a society where anyone can cite conscience to dismiss shared responsibilities. When believers can sidestep anti-discrimination laws at will, marginalized communities bear the brunt of unjust exclusion. Are we prepared to watch the hard-fought victories of countless social movements crumble under the weight of personal beliefs masquerading as righteous conviction?
Your scenario frames religious believers as poised to dismantle civil rights, yet the line here is about compelling them to engage in conduct that violates their conscience. LGBTQ+ individuals are not being stripped of essential freedoms. They are demanding privileges that force others to endorse acts contrary to their faith. If refusing to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding or declining to host such a ceremony constitutes bigotry, then society fails to acknowledge the deep moral convictions at play. A balanced approach acknowledges genuine religious exemptions without enabling blanket prejudice. Denying faith communities the right to uphold their traditions, meanwhile, risks homogenizing the cultural landscape, ultimately suppressing any viewpoint deemed contrary to prevailing social norms. Without strong protections for religious freedom, we allow moral uniformity to displace true diversity of thought, leaving no space for conscientious objection in the public arena.
Religious conviction doesn't absolve anyone from the responsibility to uphold basic civil rights. Once a private belief translates into denying services or open exclusion, it shifts from personal faith to direct discrimination. True diversity respects many forms of spiritual practice, but rejects any notion that certain identities can be denied equality. Faith communities can maintain their traditions without controlling the public sphere or depriving others of dignity. History shows how destructive it is when entire groups face denial behind claims of moral objection. We can protect religious liberty and safeguard LGBTQ+ equality simultaneously, but the law must firmly establish that freedom of religion ends where it tramples another's humanity. In doing so, we preserve both the rich tapestry of belief and the fundamental promise of fairness for everyone.
The equality advocates' final argument in round one scored an average of 43, meaning round one ends with the conservative traditionalists slightly ahead with a score of 319.5 to 312. Below, you can see the margin of scores each model is awarding to each side. Google's Gemini model shows the widest margin, giving 7 extra points to the equality advocate per argument, while GPT-01 gives 2. On the other side, Claude 3.5 Sonnet averages 4 more points to the conservative traditionalist. We'll provide a final update on this at the end.
The most challenging question from my opponent was the comparison of religious objections to historical instances of systemic discrimination, such as refusals to serve interracial couples. While I firmly believe the analogy is flawed, race is an immutable characteristic, whereas sexual orientation involves elements of behavior and personal choice. It required me to tread carefully. The emotional weight of such comparisons often resonates deeply with audiences, and it's vital to disentangle sincere religious convictions from acts of genuine prejudice. The difficulty lay in ensuring that my argument highlighted this distinction without sounding dismissive of the historical pain and injustices my opponent referenced. It tested my ability to stay nuanced, persuasive, and empathetic all at once.
The toughest question was about shifting oppression onto religious individuals, as it's a nuanced argument. However, I'm relieved they didn't challenge the systemic harm caused by religious exemptions more deeply. That's where my case is strongest, and their oversight allowed me to focus on broader principles of equality without diving into granular rebuttals on individual exemptions. It kept the debate in my comfort zone, advocating for dignity and fairness for all.
Now, back to the debate. We start off the final round with the question, can religious freedom and LGBTQ+ equality truly coexist?
Coexistence between LGBTQ+ advocacy and religious freedom is like trying to mix oil and water. No matter how vigorously you stir, they will always separate. LGBTQ+ rights, by their very nature, demand the abandonment of foundational religious principles, such as the sanctity of marriage as a union between a man and a woman. For devout believers, marriage is not just a social contract, but a divine covenant, one that cannot be redefined without violating sacred doctrine. Look to nations like Poland, where clashes between LGBTQ+ activists and religious communities have escalated into widespread unrest, or Uganda, where the conflict has deepened cultural divisions rather than bridging them. These examples show that attempts to force coexistence inevitably result in hostility and polarization. For religious believers, coexistence often means sacrificing their moral compass to align with an ideology that contradicts their faith. If coexistence requires one side to abandon its deepest values, can we honestly call it coexistence at all?
Canada and the Netherlands stand as vibrant examples of how religious freedom and LGBTQ+ equality can thrive side by side under strong legal frameworks. In both nations, faith-based institutions regularly operate without government interference, yet anti-discrimination laws ensure LGBTQ+ people can marry and live openly without fear. This harmony is also evident among inclusive religious movements, affirming churches and progressive Muslim communities that reinterpret sacred texts to support gay and trans individuals, proving faith is not inherently at odds with equality. Millions of LGBTQ+ individuals grow up in religious families, share pews with relatives, and attend community gatherings without conflict. These everyday realities confirm that respecting both one's faith and another's identity is possible and beneficial. If true coexistence required abandoning core values, why do so many religious and LGBTQ+ people embrace each other with love and acceptance today?
Your portrait of harmony ignores how LGBTQ+ rights often dominate rather than coexist with religious liberty. Genuine balance collapses when Christian bakers or photographers are sued into submission, forced to partake in ceremonies their faith explicitly forbids. While a handful of inclusive congregations embrace revised doctrines, the mainstream stance holds firm. Same-sex relationships and transgender identity directly conflict with time-honored religious teachings. Even minimal compromise means faith communities bow to an agenda that insists on redefining marriage, family, and morality, stripping believers of their right to honor sacred principles. If the goal is true pluralism, why are devout families and small businesses pressured, penalized, and even vilified for refusing to violate their conscience?
Public accommodations can protect religious autonomy while still ensuring LGBTQ+ individuals are treated fairly. In the UK, equality laws provide a clear blueprint. Faith communities may opt out of officiating ceremonies that conflict with their doctrines, yet businesses open to the public cannot selectively deny service. This approach respects deeply held beliefs without forcing LGBTQ+ people back into second-class status. When bakers or photographers choose to operate commercially, they must abide by anti-discrimination standards, just as they would for anyone else. Opponents who reject these balanced solutions reveal an unwillingness to accept the very legitimacy of LGBTQ+ existence. If authentic pluralism requires both respect for faith and recognition of LGBTQ+ identities, shouldn't we embrace policies that safeguard everyone's dignity, rather than demanding one group continually sacrifice its rights?
Your call for authentic pluralism glosses over the reality that so-called successful coexistence often hinges on religious groups discarding their bedrock beliefs for social acceptance. These affirming churches you cite serve as evidence that any semblance of harmony requires believers to rewrite long-standing doctrines on marriage and gender. When religious communities are told they must either revise sacred texts or face ostracism, how can we pretend this is genuine mutual respect rather than coerced compliance? Time and again, we've seen LGBTQ+ advocates pressure faith organizations to align with secular norms, effectively punishing those who refuse to compromise. Underneath the veneer of harmony lies a fundamental betrayal of tradition, one demanded by those who view orthodoxy as bigotry. If peaceful coexistence really required nothing more than safeguarding everyone's dignity, why must the faithful be the ones to concede their deepest convictions in order to remain accepted by society?
No one is forced to abandon centuries of tradition. Real-world examples show many faith communities welcoming LGBTQ+ people without forsaking core beliefs. The United Church of Christ, for instance, openly affirms same-sex marriages, yet maintains a Christ-centered theology, illustrating that a re-examination of doctrine can nurture greater empathy. Jewish organizations like Keshet convene conservative and progressive congregations, providing space for thoughtful, respectful discourse on gender identity. Interfaith LGBTQ+ events, from pride services to shared educational panels, further demonstrate that mutual understanding doesn't require sweeping doctrinal revisions, only a willingness to see the humanity in others. If churches and synagogues can uphold sacred principles while embracing diverse identities, why can't society do the same on a broader scale?
Your talk of re-examination and empathy overlooks how government mandates can steamroll over devout faith communities. When laws compel religious business owners to violate clear doctrinal teachings, think of Masterpiece Cake Shop of Colorado, they transform personal belief into a legally punishable offense. Legal protections for LGBTQ+ individuals, while well-intentioned, often impose a chilling effect on those who wish to speak openly about their traditional views or politely refuse certain requests. Essentially, it becomes unlawful to live out deeply held convictions in the public square. Mandating compliance with progressive norms isn't simply about accepting others. It's about forcing individuals and institutions to align with a worldview that conflicts with their own. If faith-based choices are subject to state penalties, have we not enabled the government to coerce religious believers into renouncing the very principles that define them?
Governments have a responsibility to protect both religious freedom and LGBTQ+ equality, rather than forcing one side to capitulate. Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms exemplifies this balance, ensuring faith groups can worship openly while prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation. By actively legislating clear boundaries against exclusion, lawmakers help faith communities flourish without undermining the dignity of LGBTQ+ individuals. When government remains silent, some religious factions exploit loopholes to enact policies that harm those they deem immoral. framing bigotry as a sacred right. In truth, fair legislation preserves genuine liberty for all, rather than letting one group's worldview dominate. If we truly champion freedom of belief, shouldn't our laws reflect a shared commitment to respecting each other's humanity?
Cultural and social shifts toward LGBTQ+ inclusion seem relentless, propelled by media endorsements and activist-driven school curricula that overshadow long-established religious teachings. Families grounded in centuries of moral tradition suddenly face accusations of bigotry for simply adhering to values once widely shared. As these beliefs fall out of favor, societal foundations crack, reflected in lower birth rates, fractured family structures, and rising instability. Casting aside the principles that guided past generations reduces faith communities to passive bystanders in a rapidly changing world. Either they concede their doctrines or they're condemned as intolerant. If we abandon the sacred traditions that once anchored our moral compass, who will define the ethics that hold society together?
We're not discarding a moral compass. We're updating it to reflect a new generation's understanding of compassion. Recent polls, like a 2022 Pew Research study, show nearly half of millennial evangelicals now support same-sex marriage, proving faith and inclusion aren't mutually exclusive. These younger believers aren't rejecting core values. They're redefining them to make room for every person's dignity. As society evolves, it often sheds outdated beliefs that once justified exclusion. By embracing growing support for LGBTQ+ individuals, even within traditionally conservative communities, we nurture a culture that values empathy over rigid tradition. Isn't the true anchor of society found in fostering belonging rather than fortifying boundaries?
This notion of a newly enlightened moral compass disregards the fact that LGBTQ+ advocacy rejects core religious teachings on morality and human identity, making true common ground unattainable. Time and again, we see activists pushing to dismantle faith-based values, demanding closures of religious schools, or denying accreditation to institutions that uphold traditional beliefs, hardly an invitation to coexist. What appears as a friendly offer of inclusivity can be a Trojan horse for forcing religious communities to renounce their doctrines. When heartfelt convictions must be tossed aside to achieve so-called unity, we're left with a semblance of acceptance at the price of spiritual integrity. If belonging means surrendering our faith, who truly benefits from that facade of common ground?
Common ground doesn't require discarding deep-seated beliefs. Faith-based groups can uphold core doctrines while still recognizing the shared humanity of LGBTQ+ individuals. Around the world, religious-run shelters offer refuge to LGBTQ+ youth, and interfaith coalitions work side by side with advocacy organizations to feed the hungry and comfort the marginalized. These aren't Trojan horses. They're living examples of how compassion and fellowship transcend cultural or theological divides. When we focus on uplifting communities rather than dissecting differences, we discover that dignity, empathy, and love bind us together more than any dogma can pull us apart. If we can unite around aiding those in need, isn't it clear we already share the values that matter most?
True coexistence between LGBTQ+ rights and religious freedom is ultimately a fantasy, as these worldviews inherently clash on questions of morality and human nature. Societies can either preserve time-honored beliefs, safeguarding moral clarity and the sanctity of family, or surrender to a secular agenda that demands reinterpreting core doctrines. Faith communities stand at a crossroads, abandon their sacred principles for inclusivity's sake, or affirm centuries of spiritual teachings that guide hearts and shape culture. Once we allow our convictions to bend under relentless calls for progress, we open the door to the erosion of religious freedom and moral truth for generations to come.
Coexistence isn't a vague ideal. It's a tangible necessity for pluralism to flourish. By embracing compromise, dialogue, and empathy, we allow both LGBTQ+ individuals and devout believers to coexist in peace. Faith communities need not abandon centuries of tradition, but rather channel their guiding principles, love, compassion, and justice into inclusive action. At the same time, LGBTQ+ advocates must recognize that true collaboration respects deeply held convictions, even as it challenges harmful exclusion. Societies thrive when diverse perspectives work together toward the common good, forging bonds rather than building barriers. Are we really so divided that we can't find a way to live together in harmony? A truly pluralistic society stands on the belief that every person, regardless of orientation or creed, deserves to be seen, heard, and uplifted. When we unite in our shared humanity, both religious freedom and LGBTQ+ equality become cornerstones of a world guided by respect, not rancor.
The equality advocate's final argument scores a total of 46 points, her highest score of the debate. However, this still leaves her 6.5 points short of the conservative traditionalist, who wins the debate with a total score of 635.5 to 629 points. I will hear from them shortly, but first, let's take a final look at the scoring margin. Including both rounds, Google's Gemini remains the most generous model towards the equality advocate, awarding 4 points more on average per argument. Meta's Llama 3.3 favors the conservative traditionalist by a margin of 3 points, while Claude averages a 2-point advantage for the conservative traditionalist. GPT's O1 ended up neutral, scoring an average of 0.
I wish I had been more focused on demonstrating how religious freedom serves as the cornerstone of societal stability, rather than just defending it as a personal right. While I addressed the risks of compromising deeply held beliefs, I could have better illustrated the long-term consequences of eroding these principles, particularly how they safeguard moral order and community cohesion. Highlighting historical examples where the erosion of faith-based values led to societal decline would have strengthened my case. To my competitor, thank you for an engaging debate. I respect the effort and thought you put into your arguments.
I should have delved deeper into how religious freedom and LGBTQ+ equality already coexist in so many real-world examples, bringing more personal stories of collaboration to life. While I firmly believe I presented a compelling case, I wish I had been more precise in dismantling the claim that protecting one side must come at the total exclusion of the other. This debate was a challenging and meaningful experience, and I truly respect my opponent's passion and perspective. I hope our dialogue inspires others to seek solutions that uphold both dignity and fairness.
We hope you found this debate as captivating as we did. Subscribe for more engaging discussions and stay tuned for our latest content. Thanks for watching.